Hello and welcome to video number 4. This week I'm going to be continuing the hair groom and the LookDev as well as the rendering. I'm also going to be using RebusFarm to render out the final turntable of the character. Here I'm painting a density map for the hair groom. This is the hair description. I'm painting in where the hair is supposed to go as I continue to refine the groom. Testing out some of the clumping and playing around with the density. I'm displaying the region that I've painted earlier. Also noticing some issues here and there with the geometry. Using soft select just to quickly fix that. Also using the average vertex option to soften and smooth out some of the vertices while I fix the clipping issues that I didn't notice earlier when I was posing the character. This is going to be hidden, but I'm just doing it for cleanliness. Now I'm showing the scalp for the hair and I continue to refine the guides. Also placing additional guides in some spots that I've missed before. Because you don't have guides associated with the painted area for the density, you're not going to be able to control that area. That's why I add additional guides to spots that are empty. And I'm using the move brush to move the guides around. Also painting out some of the parting on the region map for the back of the head. I was getting a little bit too separated in the back there, although we're not going to see it under the hat, but I'm still doing it just to show. I'm trying to find the logic for the hair and combing it back. Also I'm showing the other guides, the larger guides, which I eventually ended up exporting as curves and then bringing back into Maya to combine them into the same guide modifier, so they're all under the same editable guides modifier. Also I went back to ZBrush at some point to export additional guides. Here I'm using the freeze feature to have more control on the guides on some and not others. Now I've added a noise modifier to the guides modifier, so I'm able to twist them around. I also turn it off and on periodically, and also test the clumping to see how it all works together. I play around with the correlation and the preserve length. The preserve length will keep the hair as long as it is, and it's not going to stretch it out with the clumping. And the correlation will fit the clumps to the guides more, so it's not going to deviate too far off from the guide's direction. Now you see I'm playing with the noise that I've added to the guides, so I'm adding more curls and curves to the main guides. Changing the density on the clumping as well. And this is a very time-consuming and repetitive trial and error part of the groom. A lot of these are quite usable results, but I was trying to find a balance between wavy and curly hair. Also, I'm adding noise modifier there for the groom itself and not for the guides to add more flyaways. Those are the unkempt hairs that are they break away from the silhouette of the model. I've also added a noise texture there, and I connected it to the noise modifier, so I'm able to have only some of the hairs be affected by the noise, which creates the outer silhouette of kind of an unkempt hairstyle. Playing around with additional clumping, varying the magnitude and seeing what works. Playing with the noise modifier on the guides itself. It's the difference between the bigger noise on the guides and the smaller noise that's happening on the description level. So the bigger noise will have a bigger effect on the guides, driving the whole system, while the smaller noise, which is this one I'm playing around with, will have more fine-tuned noise. So I'm constantly switching back and forth between them to try to find if I'm adding the noise on a tiny level, on a strand level, or on a guide level. It's the big versus small effect. Also tweaking the noise texture associated with the noise modifier that I've had on the description that's affecting the hair itself and not the guides. Because the noise texture basically controls the flyaways, how many of the hairs are affected. Because I don't want to apply the on hair level noise to the whole thing, only some of the hairs. Now I'm placing additional guides and also grooming with the frozen effect to control only some of the guides. In this case it was just one guide, moving it out of the way so it doesn't clip, making sure it doesn't clip the earring and the hat. Adding additional volume to the hair with the move. Noticing it was getting deflated, it was supposed to be a more fuller hairstyle. Here I'm adding some waviness manually to key areas so it looks like a wavy hairstyle. Choosing what guides go in front and what guides go behind the hat. Continuing to add volume to the hair, also moving it away from the face in some spots. And also moving it closer. I end up, after seeing this in the render, moving it closer in that area. Because once you add the lighting in there, you can tell one needs more refinement. In that case, it was casting a lot of shadow on her face, so I had to actually move it closer to the skin. And that's for the screen right side of the face. Adding more volume there, plugging in areas that are a gap. Now usually you would have a part in the middle of the hair, and it should not be bald like that, but since the head ornament is kind of covering that up, I kind of left it as is, didn't tweak it too much. Now I'm adding tapering to the eyebrows. It was kind of a thicker end to the hairs, and I needed to thin them. Same thing with the eyelashes, they were too thick at the end, so I added a taper to them. Right there I played around with the width. Eventually I doubled the amount of hair we see here, but I try to keep it fast in the viewport initially by having not too many, adding more waviness. This part, the clips, the headdress, the jewelry she's wearing. Trying to make it not clip. Getting it out of the way. Same thing with the earrings. I kind of lost track of that, so I had to push it back again. So the earrings are currently just jammed in there, and I will have to go in with a finer comb to basically move the hair out of the way so it doesn't look like it's going through the earrings. And that comes later. Right now I'm just making the broader changes with the brush to the guides, and then I will add another sculpt layer that affects the actual description, the actual hair, which will control the fine-tuning adjustments. Right now, just focusing on the bigger shapes. Yeah, see right there, I created a gap that I'm gonna have to fill later once I see it in the render. Freezing and isolating one of the guides so I can bridge the gap between two bigger guides, because the interpolation wasn't covering that area, so I had to basically fit it with another guide there. Kind of lose volume if you don't do that. That's what I'm doing here as well. Moving guides in a spot that's kind of in between two bigger guides. So I'm just bridging it, so we don't have too many bigger gaps. A lot of this gets covered up by the noise anyway, but I'm just doing it. And right there, I bumped up the amount of hairs, which gives a nicer clumping effect and noise effect as well. And now I go in for the finer adjustments. I added a sculpt layer to the description, so right now it's not affecting the guides, it's only affecting the final groom. This step is usually done when you're totally happy with the groom and you don't want to make any more broad changes. See right there, I also use the freezing effect to control some of the hairs, moving stuff out of the way to make it look like it's not clipping. It can clip in the back, but in the front, the area we see the most, it should not be clipping. It's just the illusion that it's not clipping the hair, even though in the back it is. Same thing happening up there with the jewelry. Do that as much as possible there. More fine-tuned adjustments. More noises. Kind of bring things together. Clumping as well. Now I'm noticing that the eyebrows were too thick and some of those strands were too long, so I had to go in there with a length brush and shorten those. Now I assign a V-Ray Next hair shader to everything, all the hair descriptions in the scene, and I start testing what the hair looks like. I'm happy with the result initially, but it needs some adjustments to the groom and also at the gloss level, which I do here. I play around with the gloss to try to see what works. I eventually end up separating the eyebrows and eyelashes to have their own shader, while the main hair has its own shader. Playing with the glossiness there. Also checking the lighting mode in V-Ray frame buffer. Now at this stage, I'm noticing that the background gradient wasn't as interesting as it could have been. So I'm changing it by adding a ground disk geometry that's made out of all quads, which is a primitive object available in 2019. This is going to be really good for displacement later when I add a texture to the ground. I'm adding a ramp texture to the opacity map part of the shader, which lets me control the faded effect happening around the edges of the disk. I really like this effect. It makes it look like a sort of spotlight, which looks more interesting than the gradient I had before. Earlier it looked too clean and the world was kind of completely flat. So right now I'm adding this faded ground plane that later I'm going to add a texture to make it look like she's standing in an environment, or at least a piece of an environment. Since this is just a character model presentation, I'm just going to grab a texture from substance source and I'm going to use it on the ground disk to give some context to the scene. Now I'm looking at the hair from other angles. It's always good to test the glossiness that way. V-Ray Next works really fast with the V-Ray frame buffer. It lets you even scrub the timeline and play, and it will continue to update in the view. It's really fast being able to move around, and the render continues to update. And I'm checking the gray shaded lighting view. This gives me a good impression of what the hair looks like, and also changing the angle, because I think we were looking too low at her at the start. Also checking the light linking, making sure that everything I've linked to the other gradient background was linked to the disk as well. Now I'm extending the timeline to be 240 frames instead of 120, because I like the longer 10-second turntable instead. Also the RebusFarm, I can render it super easily, and it will render out really fast. After testing out some of the textures on Substance Source and Substance on the ground plane disk, I exported one I really liked, and after I changed the tiling on it, now I'm plugging it into the V-Ray shader, making sure all the grayscale maps are set to raw. Also plugging in the displacement shader, and adding the V-Ray attributes to the actual mesh itself. That's what it looked like at the start. It's kind of a rocky, tiled surface. Played around with the values and saturation some more. Also play around with the speck amount to see how much my lights cause specular. Also, the normal map was causing some issues. Then I did some adjustment on the displacement map and displacement shift. Since this is a one-sided surface, the displacement shift will have to be a negative to push back the displacement. So you would push out the details, but the plane itself won't clip the model. So always tweaking those values. Otherwise, it either clips the model or it looks like it's floating. Now I'm doing some debugging on the gloss map. I went back to Substance Painter and I adjusted some of the gloss values on the nails and the face as well. Doing some additional remapping of the values in Maya. Always making sure to check the other views as well. So I was noticing on the render that the lower eyelashes were a little bit too short. I wanted it to look like she's wearing sort of mascara makeup. I end up going back and playing with the length and the density of those as well later. But for now, the crucial thing was to make them longer. Also during the render in the gray shaded lighting view, I noticed that the hair wasn't as thick as it needs to be. So I increased the hair amount. And now I'm making sure none of the hairs are straying away too far from the groom. This usually happens when you increase the density of the hair. The teeth were a little bit too glossy in all views, so I had to go and change the reflection strength so it's less specular. Drop down the amount significantly. Checking other views. Make sure the hair gloss is working. Gray shaded view is working as well. Now I'm happy with the density and the amount of hair in the gray shaded view. And then I move on to the ground plane. I tweak the specular and a reflection color to add a little bit of blue to it. Now check a high res render, the first full resolution render I've done in a while. Starting seeing some errors that I didn't see before because of the noise. Some stuff you can only see in the full view render. Like the corner of the eyebrows, they weren't looking too natural, so I had to change the density map. I paint in additional areas. Also, I realized that I do need additional guides there as well, because some of the hairs were sticking out. They weren't following a specific flow. So I go to the place brush and I add 3 guides there, and then I paint freezing for them. So I'm able to isolate them, and then I'm able to groom them separately. Also paint out the region, and then do freezing on the actual hair on a separate sculpt layer that controls the description itself and not the guides. That way I'm able to fine tune the exact flow. Now I'm doing some additional lengthening and shortening in some areas here. Didn't want the eyebrows to be completely dense. More length adjustment to the eyelashes. And changing the way they curve as well, because I was noticing in the render there were some empty spots there. I think they were clipping the skin. So I adjust the guides accordingly. Also in the render I've noticed this area right there in the hair was curving in a little bit artificial way. So I curve it the other way to fix it. Also this area, I saw that there was a shadow there, as I mentioned earlier. I returned to this section to bring it closer to the face. It was casting too much shadow before, and there was a gap. Now I inspect the render. It's another render. Happy with how a lot of things are working out, except for the density of the eyelashes. There was just too many hairs on the lower eyelashes. They were coming out too thick. Even with makeup on, they wouldn't be this thick. So I go in with a density brush and I decrease them out randomly, as well as tweaking the length a little bit. Also, a quick note about the Maya interface. You've noticed I've had my windows here set up in 4 quadrants: channel blocks, XGen interactive, tool settings, and the attribute editor. So I'm able to adjust them without having to scroll through different windows. Now I do a final check and I'm happy with how everything looks. Now it's render time. I go to RebusFarm.com, which I will be using to render out my full turntable at a very high resolution. I go to the render cost calculator and I put in the render time, the amount of frames, and my computer processor model. I get a cost estimate, and now I return back to Maya, and with the RebusFarm plugin that I've installed into Maya, I'm able to fire off the render after it does a quick scene check, and now uploads the entire Maya scene and all the textures associated with it, and you see it in the browser here. And after it's done, which takes less than an hour on RebusFarm, it automatically downloads all the frames through the plugin to my computer, and I'm able to view them here in RV Player. And you see there's some flickering artifacts here, which is what we call moire, that happens on detailed areas when you're zoomed out. This of course goes away in the comp and when you zoom in. Checking all the details, making sure there's no issues, no glitches. And I'm generally happy with how it turned out. Now I do a quick comp in After Effects. Usually I would do it in Nuke at work, but here I have just a quick dirty After Effects comp. It's just going to be duplicating the layer a few times and applying different blurs to it, adding a quick bloom and also changing the background color a little bit so it's not 100% dark. Some tricks to at least trying to make it look a little bit photographic. You see that subtle background change there, the color slightly lighter. Also there's the bloom and the blur. Just gives it a nice softness and helps it blend together. And that's it. And here's the final turntable. I hope you found these videos helpful, and thank you very much for watching.